Chair Moore.
Present.
Chair Moore is present. Member Bradford. Member Bradford is absent. Member Grills. Present. Member Grills is present. Member Holder. Present. Member Holder is present. Member Jones Sawyer. Member Jones Sawyer is absent. Member Lewis. Present. Member Lewis is present. Member Montgomery Stepp. Here. Member Montgomery Stepp is present. Member Tamaki. Here. Member Tamaki is present. Madam Chair, there are 9 task force members, and the member needed for a quorum is 5. There are 6 members present. A quorum has been established.
Thank you, Parliamentarian Johnson. Now that a quorum has been established, we will turn to the next item on the agenda, which is item number 7, discussion and potential action, task force approval of draft report part 5, economic expert analysis and final recommendations of task force regarding calculations of reparations and forms of compensation and restitution, including answers to experts' 5 key questions, and economic expert analyses presented by the expert team, of which Dr. Thomas Kramer is here with us today, and myself and Member Lewis. So without further ado, we'll turn to Dr. Thomas Kramer, who will give a comprehensive overview of what's been discussed from the March 3rd and 4th hearing to present, and then we'll have a conversation and then action around the conversation. So Dr. Kramer, you are recognized.
Hello, can you, oh yeah. Can I ask whether my fellow experts are in the room electronically or? Yes, okay, good. Hi, Dr. Spitz. Okay, then I'll start going through the presentation, and I'll ask my fellow experts to correct me where I'm wrong or to chime in with any additional information. Basically, our chapter outline is based on 5 harms that we've focused on. If you could go to the next slide. These were selected from a long list of harms and atrocities that the state of California is at least partially responsible for. The expert team has selected 5 of those harms from a longer list. And it's not that we say that these are the most important or that the others are unimportant. That is not the point at all. All harms should be addressed in the reparations proposal. But these are harms for which we thought we would have data. That's one criterion, and the other is that it's closely related to the actions of the state of California to make our estimates more defensible in the face of challenges that will undoubtedly happen once the proposal is made public. I should also say that in my presentation, I will not go into the numbers specifically because they are subject to change still as we're getting new data in. And this might continue even after the report has been published. I will instead show the process that we went through and answer any questions about that. 3 of the harms that we selected: health harms, disproportionate Black mass incarceration and overpolicing, as well as housing discrimination. We have preliminary estimates. And for 2 of the harms, we don't yet because of lack of data. That's unjust property takings by eminent domain and devaluation of Black businesses. But I will still address how we would estimate those losses if we had the data available. So I'll start with the first atrocity, health harms. Basically, what we do is we estimate the annual loss to Black non-Hispanic Californians from health disparities by computing the value of the 7.6 year life expectancy gap. That is a big gap, based on the so-called value of statistical life in the United States. That is what statisticians use to evaluate how much each individual places value on their lives. We then divide the value associated with the gap by the average Black non-Hispanic Californian life expectancy of 71 years to obtain an annual estimate of the loss to Black non-Hispanic Californians from health disparities. Now, I should say one thing right up front. When I say Black non-Hispanic Californians, I don't mean to exclude Black Hispanics who trace their ancestry back to slavery in the United States. It's just we don't have a census count of descendants of Black descendants of the enslaved yet. So what we are doing is using the definition of Black non-Hispanic Californians as a shorthand or a guesstimate of what the population, of what the size of the population with ancestors that were enslaved in the United States will end up being. But that is still an unknown until we get those counts from the Census Bureau or from California state. Now, the second atrocity, disproportionate Black mass incarceration and over-policing. We use the fact noted by Alexander that representative surveys of Americans show that people of all races use and sell illegal drugs at remarkably similar rates. So any disproportion in the prosecution of African Americans will be a measure of over-policing. So we estimate how many Black non-Hispanic Californians, and here the same caveat, this is our stand-in for Black descendants of the enslaved in the United States, were arrested for drug felonies above their population percentage during the war on drugs, roughly in the time period from 1970 to 2020. We multiply this number with the average prison term for drug offenses and with the average annual California state employee's wage, plus a term for loss of freedom to arrive at the outstanding total. And then this outstanding total is divided by the Black non-Hispanic California population in the year 2020 to come up again with a rough estimate of what might be due. And then I move to atrocity number 3, housing discrimination. Here we determine the average per capita Black-white, again, non-Hispanic homeownership wealth gap for 1930, for 1980, and then for 2019. The 2019 amount gives us the wealth disparity from all forms of housing discrimination, and we were asked at the last meeting, we were asked to include this estimate so that we don't limit it to housing discrimination only before 1977, before the Communities Reinvestment Act. The 1980 amount minus the 1930 amount provides us with an estimate of the effect of redlining only. And redlining was a federal policy, but it gave discretion to the state of California to do otherwise. And the state of California chose not to do otherwise, and therefore, in our view, is directly responsible for the effects of redlining. Now, as we did the calculations, ironically, the more specific amount for redlining only is larger due to compounding from 1980 to the present based on 30-year mortgage interest rates. And that is just the fact that compounding exponentially blows up the estimates. So the amount we estimated for all forms of discrimination are ironically less than the amount for redlining only, but we provide both of them, and the task force can make a determination which amount to go by. And I should mention, this is very important, I should mention that what we are estimating is not reparations. What we are estimating is losses to the African-American descendants of the enslaved in the United States based on the data. our calculations can be used to come up with determinations of reparations, but it's not necessarily identical. The task force can go above and beyond because some losses are frankly very difficult to estimate. I'm thinking, for example, pain and suffering. So that should be definitely also taken into consideration. So we are talking about losses here rather than reparations. Now, atrocity number 4 is, and here we don't have estimates, is unjust property takings. And here we would like to obtain rolls of blacks who California cities forced to leave with eminent domain to make room for infrastructure projects. And what we would do is we would examine the market value at the time of the property taking minus the amount paid to the owner and add in a fair measure of the estimated appreciation to the present day. Alternatively, we would use the current value of the property as a measure of compensation too, but this is problematic as in some cases, like if a highway was built right next to the property, the value may have decreased, or the property may be part of an infrastructure process, and then it's difficult to determine what a piece of highway is worth. So there are definitely these uncertainties, but that might be strategies to come up with estimates for unjust property takings. Next, atrocity number 5 is devaluation of Black businesses. And here I hope that Dr. Spriggs can chime in and correct me where I'm misrepresenting the approach. I'll just read what I have here. We plan on using the US Census Bureau's survey of business owners of 2012. That is where data is available by race of business owner. The goal will be to estimate the wealth portfolio of Black people in California that differs from whites in California. And the harm will be estimated using an equation with each state as a separate observation based on the general demand environment of state and local government contracting and household income. Then estimates will be made of the businesses formed and sales receipts generated on those factors. Many sociologists use this approach. Sorry for the typo here. That is a way to basically, if I understand the approach correctly, to get at what African Americans were able to achieve in terms of businesses and what they would have achieved had there not been devaluation of Black businesses. And then we have a further list of other harms and atrocities that were part of the original list that we started with. There's very important labor discrimination, segregated education, non-representative state commissions, environmental harm, transgenerational effects, adverse emotional and physical health consequences, and then other potential harms. We don't want to discount those. Those are all individually very important. They are sometimes conceptually more difficult to estimate. But as more sophisticated estimation methods come about, they should be addressed as well, so that an initial reparations payment could be considered a down payment, a start of a conversation, rather than an end of a conversation. And then as new information is coming in, there could be additional payments. And with that, I say thank you very much. And then I ask my fellow experts if there is anything else that I may have forgotten or misrepresented. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
I have a quick question that either Dr. Kramer or the economist can speak to. So as you all probably know, you all have made the news today, this morning, with several different headlines. And you spoke to it earlier, but if you want to articulate it a bit more, the headlines state it could cost California more than $800 billion to compensate Black residents for generations of over-policing, disproportionate incarceration, and housing discrimination. Economists have told a state panel considering reparations. So I wanted to make clear that the task force, we've yet to determine any final amounts, as you stated. But if you all want to speak to, for instance, the headlines today.
Yeah, that's difficult for me because I haven't had a chance to read the article yet. But I would say this is all premature. And as I mentioned just a few moments ago, what we are estimating are losses to African Americans who are descendants of people enslaved in the United States. We're not necessarily suggesting that those losses are equal to the reparations. That is the task of the task force to determine. I mean, yeah, I'll leave it at that and see if Dr. Spriggs wants to add to that.
I would just concur. We don't want numbers floating about as we continue our deliberations, because we're doing exactly that. And I think it's improper to prejudge what the precise number we may recommend may be, but we're only giving you our expert advice on these specific harms. The task force has full latitude to ignore it, to add to it, or to take into consideration what Professor Kramer was explaining, because there are other dimensions for which the panel of experts that make up the task force are probably more capable at addressing the intangible harms and other considerations that the task force may want to consider.
Any other comments or questions related to the presentation made by the economists today before we continue? Okay, another, I guess, lingering point that the task force has to take action on related to this particular item on the agenda is determining residency requirements. I think that the experts did a wonderful job in assisting the committee and the task force with working out what that could look like. And so on page 6 of the draft report, which is also in the presentation they gave to us, the economists have recommended that the task force recommend that reparations for community harms be provided as standard payments based on an eligible recipient's duration of residence in California during the defined harm period. For example, residents in an over-policed community during the war on drugs from 1971 to 2020. I think that perfectly, encapsulates kind of the debate that we were having over the past 2-3 months or so. And so I think that in terms of action for the California DOJ's purposes, that the task force endorse that particular recommendation in terms of the residency requirement, that it just be, we recommend that reparations for community harms be provided as standard payments based on an eligible recipient's duration of residence in California during the defined period of harm. So the implications could be you, as someone in the public comment stated, could be pushed out, priced out of California, not currently living in the state. But if you can show residency for the period of harm for those various different state sanctioned atrocities we outlined, then you would be eligible for compensation. That is essentially the main implication of that recommendation if adopted.
Could I add just?
Dr. Kramer, you're recognized.
Thank you. We were thinking that that should be the main task of the task force to make those community-based eligibility, but to also open up the possibility that somebody who can prove direct harm, for example, they had their house taken away by eminent domain, that they should get the opportunity to file for compensation, as a separate process, but that this should be possible as well. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes, definitely. So that's also another recommendation that I think that we should adopt as a task force. The third recommendation from the economists was around there should be no time limit on when an harmed individual or their heirs can submit claim for compensation. So I'm recommending that we adopt the 3 recommendations from the experts. One being for community-based harms, that residency is based on standard payments based on an eligible recipient's duration of residence in California during the defined period of harm. When we're talking about individual payments, we should endorse the recommendation that the legislature enact an individual claims process to compensate individuals that can prove specific harm. For example, an individual who was arrested or incarcerated for a drug charge during the war on drugs, especially if the drug is now considered legal, such as cannabis. And then the third recommendation from the experts, which is that the task force should recommend that there be no time limit when an harmed individual or their heirs submit claims for compensation. Montgomery Stepp, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chair. I just have a couple of questions or clarifying questions. So with regard to the time limit, it would be that even if an heir submitted a claim for compensation of harm during the time periods that we have identified, right, then they could do that. So, okay. Okay, that answers my question. Thank you. And then for the example given for residents of an over-policed community during the war on drugs from 1971 to 2020, I am thinking about those who may not have lived in specific areas that were over-policed, but they were over-policed because they were Black in an area, period. And so how does that kind of lock those folks out of this methodology we're recommending here?
Should I give the experts idea about this? Certainly, I would not say it should disqualify these individuals. This was just one example of how these harmed communities could be defined. But I understand that that's a problem to draw community lines around neighborhoods and say anybody outside was not affected. I think there should be a broader definition, but I'm not able to come up with one on the fly. So
No, this has been such a daunting task for you all. So I do want to say I appreciate it, and I understand setting this standard, definitely. I just also know that over-policing occurs to Black people, no matter where we are,
right.
And that would be the only thing I think we should keep in mind in setting the standard.
I agree.
Just to follow up on that point specifically, there are many studies, by folks like, Javon didn't, but people in his field who do the geography work that show that actually over-policing of African Americans is more likely to happen in gentrifying neighborhoods, right? So it's not necessarily that you're looking at a formerly redlined community, right, or majority Black community. You're actually looking at that gentrification moment when policing becomes very heavy to actually, expedite the gentrification process. Yes. So it's a really interesting analysis. And I guess my question for you is, I feel like you all have given us these important descriptive categories where you're refining your numbers analysis. but there's also like broader prescriptive categories that I guess we as a task force have to be thinking about, that don't necessarily, you can't necessarily tie them to specific numbers, but they are, it's just a prescriptive analysis. We're just thinking more about harms generally, like, and how to compensate those.
Right. I would totally agree with that. I think what we're doing is kind of coming up with a minimum, the losses, the minimal losses that we can basically determine that happened through the state of California. But of course, there is other harms that California was involved in, but other actors as well, and it becomes more messy to disentangle in a clear analysis. But they should definitely be considered. All forms of discrimination should be considered in reparations. So the task force should feel free to go beyond our loss estimates and determine what the right amount would be. As I mentioned before, the example of loss of pain and suffering comes in, where that is a subjective perception on the part of the victimized group that we as experts can't necessarily easily determine, but it's definitely something the task force could address.
Thank you. I think to make matters easier, we can continue the conversation, but I think any potential action should be to entertain a motion to approve draft report part 5 as presented. That would include just what we just discussed. I just wanted to highlight for the audience and also for task force members some of the major tenets in draft report part 5 as it relates to eligibility. Those are questions that were, as of to date, have yet to been resolved until we take final action via a vote. So again, I think that we should entertain a motion to approve draft report 5 as presented, with an understanding that that would resolve the residency requirements that we've been discussing over the past months. So in terms of community-based harms, it would be based on a standard payment for eligible recipients proving duration of residence in California during the harm period. So it would be, current residency would be irrespective. In terms of direct harm, there will also be a bucket for folks to prove individual direct harm for individual payments. The third tenet is that there would be no time limit for folks to file claims, either individuals or heirs. And then I guess a fourth point, also in this draft report, the economists have recommended that the elderly are prioritized. So I wanted to, Dr. Kramer or any of the other experts can speak to that point. Maybe we can discuss that as well before any further action.
Yeah, thank you very much for bringing that up. That is an important point. The idea behind that recommendation is there could be a tendency to say, well, we need to study more and more and more until we have everything figured out before we pay reparations. And that, in my view, would be prolonging the injustice, because some people, especially the elderly of today, would not stand a chance of getting their share of reparations. And it would leave them living in their depressed conditions longer. And that would be, justice delayed is justice denied is basically the idea. So yes, I would say the elderly should be prioritized in a rollout.
I would just want to reiterate the point made that this should not be, we have to have finished every harm, the research of every harm, that resolution on some of these may come much sooner, and we would hope that payments could be made on the basis of the harms considered as Dr. Kramer said, down payment on what would be the total. We do not want this to be, as we have found, California doesn't collect the data
Yeah.
And so it gets all free because it's going to take us a while to collect the data that is available. And that should not be a cause for delay. And we don't want people to be harmed because of the confounding of that kind of complication.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I guess that's part of what we need to resolve. So the other part that we need to resolve, which is still outstanding, is the actual definition of residency. For instance, would that residency mean, you can show proof that you lived in the state of California for more than half of a year of which the harm incurred? That's still kind of open for discussion. Did the economists or public policy experts, did you all have any take on that particular point? I don't think I saw it in the draft section, which is understandable. So then, the task force members will have to have a conversation about how we define residency in accordance with, I guess, this draft report once it's presented, if it's approved. I know in past conversations, we talked about, the state residency requirements, which as of now is you're a resident of California if you've lived in the state for taxpaying purposes for 6 months. So that's something that we could potentially adhere to as well. Member Scott Lewis, do you have any thoughts?
Thank you, Chair Moore. Sorry, go ahead.
Could I ask a question about, for example, how would homeless be treated with the residency requirement? Because I think that's a considerable problem in California, and it would be important, especially important, that these individuals be included.
I think we preliminary discussed that. I think we still need to have deeper conversations about that. I think one of the records of proof, so to speak, that we mentioned earlier was, a letter from a homeless shelter. But even that isn't necessarily sufficient. Not all homeless folks will be able to have that. So it's still a conversation that needs to be had. Yeah.
And also our children in the child welfare system that are placed outside of the state. And we will have to figure out how to address that so that they're not unintentionally excluded.
I think in this proposed agency that we're coming up with, there will probably have to be like presumptions of lower barriers for particular folks within the African American community, like the homeless population, like foster and adopted youth, where they won't necessarily be held to the same standards as others within the community. I think that would be, the only fair option. Member Montgomery, so did you?
No, I just wanted to add briefly to the conversation about folks who do not have shelter, and also at the rates that they receive do not return citations or letters from service providers. So that is even another barrier, that they receive a higher rate of those do not return kind of statuses or labels than other people do. That we're dealing with throughout the state of California right now. So that is another barrier to even prove any type of residency or that you have any kind of dwelling at all, because of that yet another disparity.
Dr. Kramer, you're recognized.
Thank you. Maybe one way would be for these individuals to reverse the burden of proof so that if they claim that they were homeless in California, that the state has to prove they were not.
Hi, Chair Moore.
Yes,
I noted that Attorney Newman came and spoke to you briefly. Did he clarify exactly what terms we need to specifically state around residency? So in the preliminary draft, it says that the task force recommends that any reparations program be defined by a residency or domicile requirement, as AB 3121 focuses on the harm inflicted on individuals in California as a result of the actions by California, fomented by California laws and policies. So I think what I want to know is specifically, are we being asked to, and I'm asking this question so that way we can actually decide, number of months of residency, proof of residency, and what else, if anything else, that we need to decide on. Because I think we might be presently unsure exactly what kind of residency model we're meant to establish. So did he provide any further clarification on that?
Oh, he just said define residency,
Residency,
like
okay.
the length.
Yeah, you could hear me, Michael, outside? Yeah.
Sorry, step out and that's,
I know, then
that's right the time you got. So again, just like the remainder, just like, the whole report. So the task force does not need to make a final decision on these. This is recommendations of the legislature about how the legislature should ultimately craft reparations legislation. So if the task force wants to give some guidance in the recommendations, we'd add those into chapter, I forget what chapter this is, part 7, chapter 17, that's right. We can translate that into language that would be sort of synthesizing what you're saying right now, which is what it sounds to me like is a recommendation that somebody be, I don't know if you were saying establish formal residency through being a resident in the state for a certain amount of time, and then any portion, a majority of any year thereafter, they would have eligibility, or if it's just being present in the state for more than half of the year being eligibility. I think there's a decision that needs to be made there. But again, everything gets translated into a recommendation for the legislature. And so the legislature could end up choosing, for whatever purpose, a different definition of residency and eligibility. So you don't have to make a decision. You just recommend it. And if it is just, residency plus presence in the state or presence in the state, that's the recommendation. And then it can be, again, left to the Freedmen's Agency to make determinations on eligibility. If people have been here for exactly half a year or have a challenge establishing their residency.
And so within that framework, we could, I'm sorry, to be recognized. Within that framework, we could just have like a guidelines and like touchstones. So something like these recommendations or how these laws should be interpreted liberally to be as inclusive as possible. Can we do stuff that guidelines that are that general?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's something to consider because similar to the way that the economists reference elderly people, we really should be looking at the most vulnerable people who are going to have the hardest time, meeting any kind of documentary proof requirements. And so generally, we should be trying to give guidelines and touchstones to the legislature that makes this something that's easy, and as you recommended, Dr. Kramer, one way to do that is to switch the burden of proof, right? So it's not on the individual, it's on the state. And so in that way, there's a presumption. There's a presumption of that you meet the domicile or the residency requirement, especially if you fall into these particularly vulnerable categories. Something like that.
Okay, great. So it seems like what we need to do is, again, define residency and just putting it out there in terms of, making it as easy as possible. We can, look to what's on the books already in terms of what makes you a California resident, which is 9 months. So we can maybe start there or go lower. So there's 3 things we need to do. One is, approve draft report 5, which is what the economist just presented. 2, we need to define residency. And part of that second duty, we could, use again the current California rules as a touchstone, starting with 9 months or lessening it. And then the third part of what we need to do is provide a guideline or touchstone around for hyper marginalized people within the descendant community. We need to, provide a caveat, a reverse burden of proof. So there's a presumption of eligibility for those particular communities within the descendant community. So in terms of the definition for defining residency, again, for tax purposes, you will be presumed to be a California resident for any taxable year in which you spend more than 9 months in this state. So I guess taking from that, we could define residency as you are a resident for any year in which you spend more than 9 months in the state during any given harm period. So that could be a definition we could use. But again, the conversation would be, is 9 months too much? Does it need to be lower? And we can also, entertain a motion just so that, there's some movement and then we can continue the discussion within the motion. No, I didn't.
I know. Chair Moore,
Oh, Member Montgomery Sub, you're recognized.
I have another question. I don't mean to complicate this more, but based on the potential residency requirement, is that separate and apart from the harms that have been specifically identified, the 5 harms that have been specifically identified you would have to prove that and also still live in California for the amount of time, the 9 months amount of time. Like, so for example, if I was arrested, and did like 10 years in prison for possessing marijuana or something like that, and then I got out and moved to Georgia. If I don't live in California, I would not be then eligible to submit a claim for that specific harm. I would be. So no matter what, the specific harms, folks are eligible, but it's just if we go above and beyond or whatever it is, the domicile requirement will be in place. I'm just trying to figure that out.
So the understanding that I have is that, you're eligible, as long as you can prove that you were resident in the state during the years of harm, and further to the recommendations that, the compensation would be actually tied to those years of harm. So
then what? Then where does the residency requirement come into place? Does that come into play if we take the additional harms that we've identified but can't necessarily quantify and make a decision as a task force that we will do our best to compensate for those things as well, just in generally speaking, as a resident of California?
you mean beyond what?
Beyond the five that we could quantify a bit more based on the data that is available to us. I'm just trying to figure out, where does the residency requirement fall into this? If you can prove a harm during that time period, no matter where you live,
Right.
then where would the residency requirement be attached?
The residency requirement really comes into play, not necessarily for the individual harm compensation bucket, but for the community harm compensation bucket, where we're saying that all descendants of slaves, whether you can prove direct harm or not, you should be eligible, just by virtue of you being a descendant of slave residing in the state of California.
During the period of
During the
harm.
period.
Okay, I got it. Then so that, never mind, I'm not going to confuse it more, but I got it in my head, so.
Okay.
Thank you for that.
So, I mean, sorry, go ahead.
No, can you tell me, where did the 9 months come from?
2020 publication 1031 guideline for determining resident status. That is from the Franchise Tax Board.
Because I was actually looking at that very same document and I'm going to look at it again, but I didn't see the 9 months in there, but it's a pretty dense little document.
Page 5. You will be presumed to be a California resident for any taxable year in which you spend more than 9 months in the state.
But it seems as if, whether 6 or 9 months, that there is interest in kind of conforming with the standard definition of residency for the state, or that the state uses.
I would agree with
The state
that.
has multiple.
Oh, yeah.
If you look at one
Oh,
state entity, it gives you one thing. You look at another state entity, one gives you 9 months, one gives you 366 days, right? 1 day pass for the UCs, the DMV gives you yet something else. So there's no uniformity.
But there is uniformity within the kind of the state tax code, right? So what are the, is that what you were referring to earlier, Chair Moore? It's what number of months?
2020 publication.
Just as a precaution, if we are going to be recommending at some point that these funds not be taxable, I don't think we should be using the tax code as our statutory standard. We should be looking for a public works code, either something like the UC requirements or other public programs, whatever their residency requirements are. That's what it should be pegged to.
Well, I don't think that's, using the tax basis for residency is implying somehow that, these reparations would be taxed. I mean, I think what I'm trying to get at, and I don't really have a hard view on what framework we use. It's just, trying to find a uniform framework. And so something like the UC residency, I mean, that's about tuition benefit, you know what I mean? And so the motivation behind some of those, I think, parsed out a little bit before pursuing that.
But isn't that what we're doing is about benefits? So it seems like it aligns better with a benefits mentality than a state tax mentality.
Yeah, I think I just want us to have a view,
I guess, Chair Moore, if I could be recognized, I'm sorry. I guess I would just like to know, for the majority of the task force, do we think 9 months is too long or too short? And then we can maybe attach it to some other standard. I do think that it needs to be with another state standard so that it is not an arbitrary decision by us. But what else, do we know what other standard? I know we've discussed it a little bit before, but do we know what those others are? And I think maybe just putting them out there at this point so we can kind of have a gauge for the DOJ to go back with and the economists to go back with. Because I'm okay with attaching it to the 9-month framework, understanding that we're using that as a standard and not necessarily as following with the entity, and the entity will necessarily be involved in the reparations compensation. As long as we say we believe that should be tax-free, I think that saves us from that. But I'm just more interested in tying it to a state agency or another standard that's out there.
Well, if we go with the UC standard, that's 366 days. So that's longer than the FTB standard of 9 months. Just putting that out there.
Yeah, and that was my point, so the purpose of that long, state residency requirement for the UC is so that the UC can actually extract higher tuition from students, so it isn't actually a benefit model, following the UC standard. So, I mean, just
Point of clarification. So the UC is permanent residency for eligibility for the lower rate versus annualized residency for paying taxes. You could pay taxes and then not be a resident of the state the next year and then pay taxes the next year. So I think implicit in this is the determination of, as the experts have discussed, if you're looking at an annualized basis of harm and different years in which harms would be applicable, you go with an annual residency rather than a permanent residency threshold, because you wouldn't have if you're talking about being present in the state for a certain period of time in order to be eligible for reparations on an annualized basis in that year, obviously 366 days wouldn't work. So it would need to be something that's definable on an annualized basis if the intent is to go with reparations based on establishing residency for the harms that are covered by an annual basis for each of those years that you're a resident.
Montgomery Steps question about 9 months. Does it need to be shorter? Is that a good point, irrespective of where the rule comes from? Should it be longer, but less than obviously 12 months? Is the conversation. currently doing some research right now to tie the months to any particular agency outside of the FTB, but you know, it's gonna take a minute. Go ahead, Attorney Newman, you're recognized.
And I'm just gonna reiterate, it is well within your authority to make a recommendation based on your sense. I mean, I understand that there's a desire to tie it into something else, but if you feel like it should be, 6 months plus 1 day or 9 months for that, whatever you want to recommend. And really the point here is to give us guidance so that we can write up something in the final report that's going to make clear that you're recommending, the reparations be on an annualized basis for presence in the state or residency in the state during that year for all years of eligibility or all years of harms. And then we can make that a recommendation to the legislature. And if the legislature feels a need to ground it in some other standard, they would be able to do that through Leg Council, as you heard from Leg Council on implementation.
Chair Moore? Thank you. Dr. Kramer, could you provide some clarification on the housing discrimination period? So there's two options, the 1933 to 1977 or 1850 to present. And I know you had briefly discussed, the kind of ongoing calculative work that you're doing that might allow for a kind of continuing period through the present. But if you could just reiterate the rationale for that.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. The 2019 estimate that we produced basically theoretically takes into consideration all forms of housing discrimination because it goes back to the beginning of the state, so time before 1933, and it also considers things like gentrification and the subprime mortgage crisis after 1977. But the problem is that it takes a snapshot in 2019 and doesn't compound up for any. I mean, you look at the inequality in housing that existed in 2019, which is a product of this whole history, but it doesn't allow for compounding effects to accrue like we had for the redlining period, which ended roughly in 1977, not effectively, but by law. And then we could say, well, from 1980 on, at least reparations should have been forthcoming. They didn't. So what does that cost with compound interest? And that adds up to a larger amount. So that was the confounding thing. Even as we did the calculations, that was something to wrap our minds around, which seems counterintuitive. It would be ideal if we could estimate each form of discrimination in its time period separately. So, for example, discriminatory zoning before 1933, redlining from 1933 to 1977. Then, if we could find a time period and a clear way of measuring gentrification, making that as an injustice measurable and then compounding that up to today, and then the same with the mortgage crisis. So that would be kind of an ideal way, but I don't see a clear way forward. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It's just other experts might have to come in and invent strategies of estimating those in the future. It's just that for us, it was kind of an ironic effect that the more specific, shorter time period led to a larger estimate than the estimate for the entire period. So, yeah, and I guess the task force will have to come to a determination how to weigh these.
So just to clarify, for each of those categories of harm, it says to the present.
Yeah.
So in terms of this discussion about the residency requirement, how are we operationalizing the present? Is it when the passage of AB 3121, or at the point to which you no longer could collect data like 2020 or 2021, or?
That's a great question. And I think right now we are not totally consistent between our different
Yeah,
harms, and
it's
we'll have to come up with a more consistent endpoint. I think in the last meeting it was discussed the endpoint should be when the bill 3121 was passed. That was 2020, right? So making 2020 the present.
Right.
And then you can always compound up to whatever is the presence at the time of the payment, but that would be for the calculation. So yeah, we have to fine tune these things. That's true.
Right. Because I do remember, didn't we have that conversation before when we used the passage of AB 3121 as
Yeah.
a kind of marker date?
Yeah, that's my memory as well.
Any other task force members have any thoughts or comments around how we should define residency, residence?
I tend to think that for most of these, we don't need to get overly particular. I think we should just make a recommendation that that it be interpreted consistent with some of the most liberal laws and statutory schemes in the state. Right? So if for purposes of public benefits, California has a 180-day rule, that's a statutory scheme that could serve as, that you can peg it to. And so we're just recommending to the legislature that they peg it to a statutory scheme with a liberal residency rule.
Want to entertain a motion? So is there a second?
Second.
It has been properly moved by Senator Bradford and properly seconded by Member Jovan Scott Lewis that in terms of residency, we define it in accordance to some of the more liberal, programs in the state. For instance, 180 days for public benefits, for instance. Hope that captures the motion. Is there any discussion on the matter? Member Holder, was that a good capturing, essentially? Okay, great. Okay, any other discussion? Hearing none, I'll turn to Parliamentarian Johnson for a roll call vote.
So before there's a vote, just so I'm clear the direction to us in drafting it. So we will include something that encapsulate a recommendation to the task force, to the legislature. We'll do some more research between now and the May 2nd meeting, and you'll see in the next draft, we'll see if we can peg that to we can give examples of things that are along those lines as liberal as possible. And then you'll see that in the next draft. If the motion passes, I should say.
Madam Chair, I will start with the voting with you.
Aye.
Madam Chair votes aye. Member Bradford? Aye. Member Bradford votes aye. Member Grills? Aye. Member Grills votes aye. Member Holder? Aye. Member Holder votes aye. Member Jones Sawyer? Absent, I'm sorry. Member Lewis?
Aye.
Member Lewis votes aye. Member Montgomery Stepp? Aye. Member Montgomery Stepp votes aye. Member Tamaki? Aye. Member Tamaki votes aye. Madam Chair, there are 7 members present and voting. There were 7 ayes, 0 nays, and 0 abstentions.
Thank you. There are 7 ayes, 0 nays, and 0 abstentions. The ayes have it and the motion carries. We're still on action item number 7. So we need to entertain a motion to approve draft report part 5, which includes the touch points that we discussed earlier, in terms of there will be opportunity for folks who are individuals to prove direct harm and be eligible for compensation. There will also be opportunities for all descendants of slaves to be eligible for compensation via community-based harm, via standard payments, if they can show residency for any given harm period. There will be no time limit for which individuals or heirs can make claims for compensation. And then the 4th touch point will be the elderly descendants of slaves will be prioritized in terms of cash payments. So once we approve draft report part 5, we can move on to the next part of the agenda. Is there a motion to approve draft report part 5?
I move that we approve draft report 5.
Is there a second? It has been properly moved by Member Grills and properly seconded by Member Montgomery Steppe that the task force approves draft report part 5, economic expert analysis and final recommendations of task force regarding calculations of reparations and forms of compensation and restitution. Is there any discussion on the matter? Hearing no further discussion, I'll turn to Parliamentarian Johnson for a roll call vote.
Yes, Madam Chair.
Aye.
Madam Chair votes aye. Member Bradford? Aye. Member Bradford votes aye. Member Grills?
Aye.
Member Grill votes aye. Member Holder? Aye. Member Holder votes aye. Member Lewis?
Aye.
Member Lewis votes aye. Member Montgomery Steppe? Aye. Member Montgomery Steppe votes aye. Member Tamaki?
Aye.
Member Tamaki votes aye. Madam Chair, there are 7 members present and voting. There are 7 ayes and 0 nays and no abstentions.
Thank you, Parliamentarian Johnson. There are 7 ayes, 0 nays, and 0 abstentions, and thus the ayes have it and the motion carries. We'll now turn to item number 8, discussion and potential action, Communications Advisory Committee and Communications Firm Implementation Plan updates presented by members Lewis, Bradford, and Charles Group representatives.
Good afternoon. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Good afternoon. Sorry I could not be there in person today. I have a small health issue, but I'm here. So just wanted to give you an update on the work we've been doing in the last 3 weeks and as we move forward to June. So next slide, please. So our activities continued over from the beginning of the month. We are still conducting, of course, the outreach for all the Sacramento meetings. We've done some more partnerships to help spread the word. I know that I've heard a couple of the audience members ask for weekend meetings. And so there's not much we can do about what day is voted on, but please know that we are making an intentional outreach effort to make sure that not only the media, but the public does know that these meetings are happening. We're continuing to, of course, conduct our media coaching and messaging and talking points. We've had some really good media hits this month. We have some national ones that are in the play. that are in play. Dr. Grills actually did the Today Show. Chair Moore is up for one that hasn't aired yet, so I don't want to spoil it for her quite yet. And we have a couple of others that we are working with. We continue to book and coordinate these interviews. That takes time, and I just want people to understand that, the back and forth and the scheduling, but that is the work that we do. We are also creating and getting ready to launch a social media ad campaign. We've also heard from the public that is something they would like to see. So we took that information back and we're trying to see how we can actually make that happen. And as well as we're getting ready to develop and start creating our post-communication strategy so that this work doesn't just stop and that people become scattered once the task force does sunset, but they do have a place to go to continue to find information and updates about what's going on with AB 3121. Next slide, please. So for this meeting, as well as we did a virtual event, we've continued to run the radio ads. We think that is important to make sure that we are approaching the communication not just one way, and by sending it out, but also through the radio ads and through the social media campaign, and also working and collaborating with organizations that are helping us spread the word. Next slide, please. All right, our activities continue to actually this month, very recently. We collaborated with the ACLU, Bar High, and the Brotherhood of Elders Network, and we delivered a virtual panel event. We actually got very, very good feedback on that. We had 111 people register for that event, and I just wanted to share some of the feedback that came out of that event. So I won't read all of it. You can see it on the slide, but know that we're getting a lot of thank yous for these virtual panels. So we want to continue to collaborate with organizations to help put on these virtual events. I think it's just, we can reach a broader audience doing this, although we also will continue to do things in person like the one that we did with Dr. Brown. Next slide, please. So we will continue to make sure we manage any media opportunities that are coming our way, as well as reaching out and pitching out media opportunities. We will continue to provide the social media assets. We have had organizations ask us to join our mailing list. And so we are adding them to our mailing list. We're seeing it get reposted. We know that the Secretary of State is reposting it. The ACLU is reposting it. So there are organizations out there that are, CJEC is reposting it. Thank you guys so much for that. And they're just sharing the information to let people know about the meetings and keep them updated about what is going on. We're also looking for and identifying opportunities to collaborate with community organizations, again, to put on, events or panels that we can help in these last few days to really help spread the word, and as well as to combat the miscommunication. Again, I heard a public comment today about the miscommunication. That is right. But unfortunately, it's hard sometimes to rein in all of the media. But as much as we can do and as fast as we can do it and as fast as we can do it, that is what we are trying to do to make sure that people have the opportunity to ask questions and to know what is going on. One of our main things that we're also doing in the next 90 days is to make sure that we're developing just post-communications activities, including the collaborations, continuing for endorsements, as well as creating a California state reparations landing page, which should be and serve as kind of a one-stop shop for what has happened, as well as to give updates on what will be happening, and any just post-support suggestions. Chair Moore had sent me information from a reporter that was saying, hey, what do we do next? And so we want to think through and think about what it is that we do next as the final report comes out. Next slide, please. And so in regards to that one-stop shop page, this is just a draft of where we're starting to go with it so that you can see, it'll talk about the bill, it'll talk about why reparations, it'll give some background information, as well as some up-to-date information as we move forward once it's launched and as the task force sunsets. Next slide, please. That is all we have in the last 3 weeks, so thank you. Any questions?
Thank you. Any questions, comments? Bradford, you're recognized.
Yes, I'm just curious as to the radio outreach, why only one station when there's a swath of stations throughout the state of California?
One is funding, and because they are in Sacramento.
Okay.
Can you speak to the funding piece a little bit?
We have to pay for the radio ads. And so we have to find funding for that. And so I don't know where all the funding come from. I just take the information back, say, hey, this is what we're trying to do. Is there any funding? I get, hey, here's an allotted amount, and we can try to do something with that. So it's not that there isn't a, from what I understand, there's not an approved budget to just do things. So we've just been trying to work with UCLA to do some of the things that the public has asked for and that we know, one, is wanted, and two, can actually help with the movement and to spread the word.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions?
I mean, again, so the radio station that you used here in Sacramento, was that free or did we pay or did you pay for it?
It was paid. It was paid.
So how did you choose? I guess because we're doing the hearing in Sacramento, that's why you chose that radio station versus maybe as a station with a broader reach in LA or something like that, or San Diego?
Yes, that is exactly why. And actually last month, we actually did use also KBLA as well as KDEE.
But what about KGLH? It's one of the bigger block.
But it's expensive.
We can work with that. So I have relationships there, so I would love to see us try to reach out there.
All right, we can take it offline and we can definitely see what we can do. That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions?
I'm just curious, have we reached out to even stations about PSAs versus paid buys, public service announcements? Because this is what this falls under instead of a commercial or enterprise.
We have, but we just haven't been able to work it out as fast as we need it to be, or as fast as we need it to happen. So like we only had 3 weeks for this. So we ended up having to write the commercial. We ended up having to work with them and to get it done. But now that we know we have a little bit more time, we will see what we can do.
All right.
Any other comments, questions? As one comment, I'll say, just putting this out there that we need to start having more education around some of the findings from the task force's report. So for instance, we've heard time and time again in conservative media or just reparations obstructionists, for instance, why does California have a task force? California was never a slave state. But this task force, we did our due diligence to disrupt that myth very, very early on in our work. So September 2021, we invited, experts like Professor Stacy Smith, who pretty much disrupted that myth, stating that there were over 1,500 Black people who were enslaved in the state. Not only that, the state of California enacted a fugitive slave law 2 short years after it was entered into the Union as a so-called free state. So I would love to see more, I guess, maybe through a PSA, just creative ways from a comms perspective to dispel those myths that kind of, obstruct what we're trying to do. So just putting that out there, like wanting to see, again, more PSAs, more comms related to California's role in the institution of slavery and, of course, its lingering badges and incidents. So I trust that you'll take that and run with it. So thank you.
Thank you, Chair Moore.
Member Grills, you recognize.
To your point, I think that there's a kind of a fine line between communications and public education. And so some of what you're describing actually is being addressed under public education, which we'll get to later. But yeah, I just want us to acknowledge that, there is a fine line and there's only going to be but so much that communications can do to educate the public, and that we also have a task of educating the public, and we have prepared some talking points that all of us will have a responsibility for communicating out to correct the narrative.
Thank you. I was literally just referencing the contract between the comms group and the Bunch Center, which I had obvious knowledge of as someone who was on the committee at a point in time with yourself. And the contract does provide funding for the communications consultant to educate the community about the task force findings. So that's what I'm referencing. But duly noted, there is a role and responsibility for the Public Education Committee to also do that work as well. Any other comments or questions? Thank you, Shauna and Mitchell. We'll now turn to the next item on the agenda, which is the break. We can elect to keep moving forward or take a 15-minute break as we are a bit behind, but we can still take our break. We'll take a 15-minute break.
Member Bradford is absent. Member Grills?
Present.
Member Grills is present. Member Holder?
Here.
Member Holder is present. Member Jones Sawyer is absent. Member Lewis?
Present.
Member Lewis is present. Member Montgomery Stepp?
Here.
Member Montgomery Stepp is present. Member Tamaki?
Present.
Member Tamaki is present. Madam Chair, there are 9 members on the task force. It requires 5 present to establish a quorum. There are 6 members present. Madam Chair, a quorum has been established, and let the record reflect that Member Bradford is present, and we have 7 members on the dais, on the task force present.
Thank you, Parliamentarian Johnson. Now that a quorum has been reestablished, we will turn to item number 10 on the agenda, which is discussion and potential action, task force approval of draft report part 4, how the state of California will offer a formal apology on behalf of the people of California for the perpetration of gross human rights violations and crimes against humanity on African slaves and their descendants pursuant to Government Code 8301.1 Subdivision B3B, or in other words, AB 3121, presented by members Tamaki and Grills.
Thank you, Chair Moore. Thank you, Chair Moore. With respect to the section on apologies, is the Department of Justice going to do that part of the presentation?
Sure, we can.
Okay, that was my understanding. I hope I didn't catch you unawares.
You want me to start with that?
Yeah.
Let me just pull it up. Oh, there's a couple. Short and sweet. So synthesizing the information that we received in the last meeting, or the direction we received in the last meeting, and then bringing together the different parts of the outlines that detailed recommendations of the task force on apologies throughout the report. We compiled the chapter that you all received, chapter 16, received and hopefully had a chance to review, that encapsulates all of the information and discussions on all of the apologies, including specific apologies that have been made in the past and recommendations of specific items for which California has to apologize, including an acknowledgement, part of the discussion in the last meeting, of individual California leaders throughout California's history for which the state should apologize in principle. Sort of the question for the task force is, aside from, confirming that you are good with the draft of the chapter as it is, we, of course, want additional information, feedback, suggestions on that, as well as additional individuals or specific actions in California's past that you think should be included in the chapter. And then the question for the task force is the degree to which we should delineate other apologies in the chapter itself. So if you have feedback on that, and then I'll remind you, the key here is the April 10th date by which you all should give us feedback on, in addition to any conversation you want to have here with regard to this chapter section, and then we can incorporate that into the final draft.
But the deadline is April 10th.
April 10th.
Okay, good to know. So just to remind task force members, in prior drafts, in terms of the recommendations emanating from the 13 chapters of the interim report, the apologies were sort of buried in each section, but we thought it would be more efficient if it was all bundled into one chapter and consolidated there for convenience and for both educators, policymakers, news media to be directed toward that one chapter. The paragraphs or the sections and the wording of those apologies are all in the published materials, and they're extensive. And I think the Department of Justice did a really terrific job in identifying them and then formatting them into one chapter. So thank you. I wonder if you could pull up the PowerPoint on the other public education points, if that's possible. And just to reiterate what Chair Moore had said in introducing this, the AB 3121 required as one of the mandates that the task force is to carry out is to educate the public on the harm. And as we heard in some of the folks objecting and criticizing reparations, the lack of information on this history that is so well documented in the interim report is not widely known. And therefore, certainly part of the task is to educate the public on that, and then also to move the needle of public opinion. And the history has been so buried, so erased, so denied that I think that's an essential element of our mission, and it's required by AB 3121. The public education part straddles two timeframes. We are doing public education now, as you know, during the lifetime of the task force, and we're making recommendations to the legislature for what should be done after the task force sunsets. And there are certain projects we're going to talk about that are being launched now that will continue on after the task force sunsets and should be supported with additional funding after we sunset. But we have a certain amount of resources that we can devote to getting this project started that we'll be talking about. So with that, can we go to the first slide? Okay. So this summarizes basically our charge, and then the outreach by task force members to the public and to the Bunch Center. And every task force member is participating in these media and also public education events that are being organized both by outside parties, but also by the Charles Communication Group. So this just summarizes some of the things that Shauna Charles talked about. There's a crossover between public education and comms, and that's necessary, but this just sort of discusses that. Next slide, please. So the major project that we're lining up is to turn this groundbreaking, monumental report, the interim report, into curriculum. And to develop curriculum is at least a year project, if not more. And it is probably most suitable in its most standard form for high school, particularly grades 9 through 12. But we'd like to be able to create curriculum in a way that in some ways, form or fashion, would impact all grade levels, but in particular high school. And some of these modules that come out of the 13 chapters, whether it's enslavement or racial terror, or education or housing or labor, can be broken out and be usable in college and the university levels, also within the prison system, and just for broader public dissemination. So the vision here is that we would develop a standard curriculum, but it would be usable for other derivative kind of works. Those could be in the form of online curriculum. It could be in the form of film documentaries, could be in the form of books, dramatic works, as well as history. And, but starting with the interim report and then letting it develop into these other forms is, has been the goal. Next slide, please. So before we get to this is really member Cheryl Grills is going to be talking about. But I do want to present a little bit about the curriculum development. So through the Bunch Center and through our own outreach, and special thanks to Professor Scott Lewis, we identified 2 Berkeley School of Education professors, Travis Bristol and Talani Britton. Both, as I said in the last meeting, have experience of teaching in the public schools, but also are professors and PhDs that are studying how to educate students within the school system, but with an emphasis toward, in particular, the Black community and the problems in terms of how that history is taught. And so we've been in conversation with them for the past month and a half, and they have produced an outline of what the next steps would be. And we are taking steps to commence the contracting process with them. And they will continue to develop and work on this even after the task force sunsets. It will be the beginning of the project. The funding that is available, I don't think will fund the entire project, but there's sufficient funds, I believe, to get them substantially into this, the process. And basically it would cover work done in 3 areas. One, beginning with community engagement with students and teachers and educators and community leaders, just to get feedback about how the history and the information in the interim report should be taught. Secondly, from that dialogue to produce and outline a model curriculum, again, the substance based on the interim report. And the third part is to have test pilots, again, back with teachers, students, districts, to educate that, to see how that would run. And then the fourth thing is coordinate it with current educational requirements, such as the core curriculum requirements in the state of California. Part of that is also assessing what materials are out there in terms of teaching on this subject matter, not only in California, but in other states, with the idea of bringing back the best and most effective methods of teaching this material. And so, again, in the interest of educating the public in a more organized and sustainable way, the curriculum we see is the way to go. And I think it's something that, as we deal with no doubt very controversial topics about what reparations are, I think curriculum is one of those areas where everybody can agree about how crucial that is. In contrast to what's happening in other states where state legislatures and school boards are trying to regulate what teachers can teach, ban books, erase history, I think this is a model really for the rest of the country as to how we begin to shine a light on a topic that no one in the rest of the states has wanted to talk about, and has chosen the path of, ignorance, willful ignorance, or willful amnesia. So I think the curriculum project is a terrific first step. I would emphasize to Senator Bradford and Assemblyman Joan Sawyer that this curriculum project, as it begins to move along, will be able to produce what the curriculum should ultimately look like, but it will need more funding to complete it. We don't have enough money to complete it, but we have sufficient funds to get it started. So like the other deliverables that have happened, including, as I said, the interim report, the curriculum is going to be another positive delivery by this task force that I think the members can be proud of. So with that, I'll stop and then turn to Member Grills to talk about, I guess you call them frequently asked questions, and then suggested answers that can be also used to educate the public, but also can be the basis for the comms activity in developing talking points.
Thank you, Member Tamaki. So there are, in fact, a number of very common questions raised and statements raised about not just the California reparations efforts, but reparations in general for people of African ancestry, African Americans, direct descendants, whatever you want to call us. Lack of information about these things is one, lack of information is one thing, I'll just put it that way. Willful amnesia or erasure is another. So there are several groups of people who are raising these questions, and I think we need to be clear about who we're going to be trying to speak to with these responses to commonly asked questions. One group of folks are people who genuinely just lack information, and they're open to receiving new information. There's another group of people who've already made up their minds and really are not going to be open to receiving information. They're just going to be outright rejected. But there's a third group also, and these are people for whom they tend to operate from a white supremacy position or point of view, and they will denigrate or belittle the mere idea of reparations. And so it's not even a question about whether or not they're even going to be able to receive any information and process that. Who are we really trying to get to and speak to? It will be that first group, people who genuinely are interested, people who don't know the real issues, who don't understand reparations. And because of the deficiency in our education system nationally and in the state around the experiences of racial oppression and racism across multiple generations in this country, they just don't know. So what we're proposing and what we've done is begun a draft document that lays out the commonly cited questions and then lists some potential responses grounded in fact and information. The responses are really designed to support those who generally want to know, and they're also designed to provide a clear rebuttal to those who are continuing to denigrate and attack the idea of reparations. This information will be useful to the communications firm, but also this information is important for all members of the task force, particularly as we're out there in the public arena trying to respond to questions and comments from the media at public meetings and town halls, et cetera. I also think that it will be useful for the general public, particularly African Americans who believe in reparations but aren't necessarily armed with the information that they need to rebut comments that are anti-reparations. So that is all we have to say on that particular part. Any questions?
I think we're done.
Senator Bradford, you're recognized.
No, I just want to commend both Dr. Grills and Mr. Tamaki for this piece. I think it's critical, and I hope we all embrace that. And I know Mr. Tamaki has reached out to my office as regarding the funding aspects of this, and this is something that I will be definitely pushing for, because I think it's critically important that we educate not only those folks who are eligible for reparations, but I think the greater public, as Dr. Grills and Mr. Tamaki have clearly stated, education is key. And sharing this curriculum, both in the schools and in the public as a whole, I think it's going to allow us to better sell what it is, but also it counters what we see happening in other states all across this country, that we can take a very progressive role in not only moving forward with reparations, but also educating the greater public as to the atrocities that happen in this country and the after effects and the remnants of slavery that still exists here in this state and in this country. So thank you for this, and I look forward to working with you guys and moving this forward.
Just reminded me of something else that I think is important to share, because it really supports the reason why we need to do this education and the correction of the narrative around reparations. There is some empirical research out there that actually has shown that the more you are ignorant to the actual issues and facts, the more likely you are to oppose anything that is in support of social justice and reparations. One really interesting article, it's actually called The Marley Effect, as in Bob Marley. And it actually tests this idea of what kind of judgments and attitudes will you have if you are armed with actual historical information versus not. And so, and the conclusion of the article, one of the conclusions is, it is essential that people have information. If we want to move the needle, people have to be armed with information.
I did forget a couple of items here, so thank you, Chair Moore, for allowing me to continue. So one of the early recommendations that we had began to develop was a fund to fund creative works, to fund documentary films, to fund books, literature, again, emanating from the interim report. And there's some, precedent for that with the Japanese American redress and reparations effort. Yep, there was direct monetary compensation, but there also was a fund to fund important educational works. And that was also duplicated within the state of California with a separate fund run under the auspices of the California Library that continues to operate. And I could say that it has had enormous impact on the public's knowledge. Whereas when this first issue was first raised in the 1980s, people had no idea that there were concentration camps for Americans, and that Americans and citizens were put there for no reason other than they happen to look like the enemy, even though they're born in this country and they're loyal to the country and so on. And if you contrast the knowledge then and the knowledge now, it's literally day and night. And part of that is attributable to those two funds. So we didn't include that in the materials. I would ask the Department of Justice to indulge me in adding that as something that we should include as part of the recommendations. And we will certainly help the Department of Justice fill that out and direct them to resources, including the funds that were created in the wake of the reparations movement for Japanese Americans. I'd say the second thing that I need to point out is outside organizations, specifically the John M. Langston Bar Association, the Black Bar in Los Angeles, and the Japanese American Bar Association have, with other organizations, been leading the charge on getting endorsements from civic organizations, from professional societies, from service organizations. And this is a multiracial group of big and small organizations from different sectors, including the faith community and others. And now that endorsement is up to 131. And I think when we reported on this at the meeting, at the last hearing, it was about 80. So literally it's growing rapidly. And we hope that by June, by the time we submit our report, we'll have several hundred, my hope. So if anybody's interested, it's supportreparations.org. One word, supportreparations.org. And there's a listing and a way that different organizations can endorse at whatever level they feel comfortable in, as specified in that website. So again, that's also part of the public education process.
Can I also add something? Yeah, I just want to say, there's also one thing, if you go to that website, you may not initially glean some of the significance of who has signed on. So for example, all 4 regions of California's ACLU, a number of bar associations, et cetera. But also, I'm really happy to say that my colleagues in the sister associations, the Ethnic Psychological Associations, the National Latinx Psychological Association, the Asian American Psychological Association, the Association of Black Psychologists, and 20 some odd divisions of the American Psychological Association have all submitted letters. And the last one that's coming in should be hopefully in the next week or 2 would be the Society of Indian Psychologists. That is a big deal for all of the ethnic psychological associations to sign on to the importance of the findings. And you can read their independent letters if you go to the website.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention last meeting, but the Players Coalition also endorsed the task force and the report. So I'll make sure that they endorse formally. The Players Coalition is a 501c3 charity and 501c4 advocacy organization that comprises of over 1,400 professional athletes across several different professional sports leagues. So that's an amazing endorsement as well.
Terrific.
Yeah. Thank you both so much for the work that you all are doing. This is super, super important. Any other questions, comments? Do we need to do a vote?
Yes, before moving on, I'll note these 2 chapters, 17 and 33, I think are the numbers. 16 and 33, hold on, sorry. 16 and 33. These 2 chapters are new. So this is the first time you are seeing the 2 chapters on the apology and on the curriculum development and educating the public recommendations. So because they are new, we would like for a vote to approve of both and move forward, subject to, I think there's some feedback about adding in language on education or artist funds, and we'll take that directly from, if you could point us to that, that'd be good, but we'll basically probably copy that over since that seems to have been successful. So it's approval of chapter 16 and 33 to move forward, and subject to the conversation that was had. And then again, reiterating, if anybody has any updates, information, edits, et cetera, by April 10th, provide that to us and we'll incorporate that into the final report.
May I make a motion? So with the caveat that further edits may be on the way and the deadline is April 10th, that I make a motion to approve the recommendations of chapter 16 and 33.
Second.
It has been properly moved by Member Tamaki and properly seconded by Member Grills that the task force approve the recommendations in chapter 16 and chapter 33 of the draft final report. Is there any discussion on the matter? Hearing none, I'll turn to Parliamentarian Johnson for a roll call vote.
Thank you. I will call beginning with Chair Moore.
Aye.
Chair Moore votes aye. Member Bradford? Aye. Member Bradford votes aye. Member Grills? Aye. Member Grill votes aye. Member Holder? Aye. Member Holder votes aye. Member Lewis? Aye. Member Lewis votes aye. Member Montgomery Steppe? Aye. Member Montgomery Steppe votes aye. Member Tamaki?
Aye.
Member Tamaki votes aye. Madam Chair, there are 7 members present and voting. There are 7 ayes and 0 nays and 0 abstentions.
Thank you. There are 7 ayes, 0 nays, 0 abstentions. The ayes have it and the motion carries. The next item on the agenda is item number 12, discussion and potential action item, DOJ updates.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The only update that we have is just to again reiterate the April 10th deadline, which you'll hear us probably say and get tired of hearing us say for the next day. But the April 10th deadline for any feedback and guidance in preparation of the final draft. That's all, just right away. Thank you.
If there are any other updates, the next item on the agenda is item number 13, which is recess. So we will be recessing and reconvening for the second day tomorrow at 9 a.m. Again, public comment will be 2 hours. Phone lines will be first, in-person comments will be second. Thank you all for coming and for participating, and see you all tomorrow.
The way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but free people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay? You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations, allows for the construction of these policies and practices and systems and structures that continue to oppress us. This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
You know, Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total black population in California is about 2.6 million. And then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, you know? But I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I got to show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR roof, don't tune in.